Hi there, my name is Kresten. For the last 10 years I've been part of the group that is putting together the program for the JAOO conferences. And having done that for some years, I've noticed that many of the interesting discussions actually take place in the hallway, or they take place at least somewhere outside of the official sessions. And so this very concept is what we're trying to capture here in this series of small clips, and put together some speakers to have this kind of more informal discussion about things that they've spoken about sessions and what other people think about that from in between the real sessions of the conference. Please enjoy. So here's a clip with Chad Fowler, Glenn Vanderburg and Marcel Molina. Chad is one of the primary resources behind Ruby Central. Marcel is very engaged in Ruby on Rails, and Glenn is just general Ruby hacker. He's been hosting the Ruby track at JAOO this year. So in this clip, we're discussing just general trends in Ruby, what's going on with Ruby VMs, what's the next big thing in frameworks, and just Ruby in general. So please enjoy.
So what do you guys see as big things in the Ruby community?
I've been answering this question everywhere I've gone for the past couple of months. So I'll just think it will lead to other things. I've been looking forward to the next killer app for Ruby because I don't want Ruby to be thought of as a web language, and I know that it is already. And I think the next killer app is a thing called Adhesion, which was developed by a guy named Jay Phillips. And in the same way that Rails makes web development ridiculously simpler and smaller and easier than things that Adhesion does before it, that for VoIP and PBX development. So it sits on top of Asterisk, and it's actually just a glue layer, but it gives you that same kind of ridiculous simplicity for developing VoIP applications that Rails does for web applications. That's the thing that I'm finding most exciting.
Glenn's been mentioning is that since Glenn and Chad have been in the Ruby community for a really long time, there was a period when the community didn't really have a firm sense on what the best practices were for Ruby development.
And to some extent, we used it as just like a version of Java with a slight and some new features in terms of how we designed things.
Or a version of Perl. With
yeah, right.
OO.
That's true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I think your point is when Rails emerged, the topic that it established this very different sense of how to develop Ruby applications and libraries, and it did all these different, took all these different approaches that through people reading the source code became new standard ways of building out libraries. And an interesting thing about Adhesion is that, I mean, clearly Jay has looked at Rails and has been inspired a lot by the Rails approach.
And internalized those lessons.
Yeah, but creating something totally new, and just taking some of those approaches to how to build something and how to present APIs and interfaces to the people using the library. So one of the big benefits, I think, of Adhesion is how nicely done it is, how much it encapsulates inside of these really expressive interfaces.
Right. Yeah, it was kind of funny what in 2002 through 2004, leading up to Rails, people were really experimenting with new ways of using Ruby and the best way to do APIs, and to some degree rediscovering things that the Lisp community did in the 60s and 70s, and then so maybe not a lot new there, but just in a different language with a richer syntax. And David pulled a lot of that together and advanced it one level, and Rails has kept doing that. And I think what we're seeing is that Rubyists have figured out this is how we want to use our language. And Jay's adhesion is a great first example of an app that uses those lessons and applies them to a different domain, but I think we're going to keep seeing that happen, and I'm excited to see what comes after that.
Yeah, the key phrase here, and it's actually become a cliche and sort of laughable outside the Ruby community, at the Ruby community, is DSL.
Sure.
So we totally overuse that. We talk about it too much. In conference proposals that I see, which is lots of them, I see DSL, probably 10 times more than I should. But the good news is, even though it's become sort of this sophomoric desire that anytime I write code in Ruby, I have to write a DSL, that's actually a pretty good basis to start from, because it sets the level so much higher than I'm going to make pluggable building blocks, which is where I was coming from as a Java programmer before I got into Ruby. And it makes the target higher, I think. And it makes things like adhesion emerge. If they're set on becoming a DSL, or a domain-specific language for telephony applications, you're going to end up with a totally different product as an API than I want to make something that wraps asterisk as an API.
And although you're right, it's a cliche and it's overhyped and overused, but that doesn't mean it's not a really powerful and valuable thing. And Paul Graham talks about a style of development where at the same time you're building your application down from requirements toward your general purpose programming language, you're building your general purpose programming language up a level to be a special purpose programming language for your program. And it sounds cool, but what good is it? What's good about it is every program has within it what Fred Brooks calls essential complexity, the crucial stuff that any conceivable solution to your problem is going to be at least this complex, because the problem's that complex. And accidental complexity, because you have to build structures and infrastructure and ways of hooking a general purpose programming language into that problem. And building the language up towards your domain is the best way I've ever seen to really those two forms of complexity in your program. It's good to eliminate as much of the accidental complexity as you can, but you're never going to eliminate all of it. And if you can just isolate it and draw a nice firm boundary and have abstractions behind which the accidental complexity lives, and then the problems described on top of that, it's a huge win, and that's what that style of development seems to give you.
Right. Eric Evans did a session yesterday. You were going to talk
I was going to say, didn't Eric Evans talk about how top-down, bottom-up is a false dichotomy? Right? But I forget what his response was to that ultimately.
I don't remember from that context, but he was talking about strategic design. And the interesting thing that if you read his book and then listen to his talk yesterday, he talks about finding the core domain and modeling that as being essential to doing the right thing.
And part of the reason that's useful is because it allows you to ignore the accidental complexity. You're really focused on the essential.
Right. His point is that the core domain was 80% of the value that you're building. That's the whole reason that you're there, is to tackle the core domain. And the rest is just 20%. But usually the actual development effort is flipped. You spend 80 or 95% on all the infrastructure and ancillary bits, and 5% on the core domain, and you usually leave the core domain for last. And he said you should spend 80% on the core domain.
I found the discovery of what the core domain is enlightening as well, because if you go with the traditional find the nouns approach, that's actually not the way to find the core domain. So he was talking about just the same sample from his book of shipping systems, and part of finding the core domain for him was, I have these nouns, but I also have these elements of the software and of the business that are critical to the quality of this thing that we're going to deliver. The differentiators. So I'm not just a shipping business, but I'm a shipping business that is successful because I'm very nimble in terms of rerouting packages or rerouting cargo. So he actually takes that and says, okay, I'm not just going to model a shipping system with all of the nouns. I'm going to model a shipping system that is about being flexible with rerouting. And he came up with a different model that way. Then back to the domain-driven design book, he says that it's essential to have a conceptual model of your software that is directly linked to your code. And that's where building the language up really makes a difference. So if you can take this, find the core domain idea, and have it directly expressible in a DSL, I think that's sort of what Rails is helping people figure out in the Ruby world, and adhesion is an example of people figuring that out.
Because the way that you did your talk on Active Record the other day is that you presented a functional model in Active Record that was completely explicit, where you were defining all the getters and setters for the attributes of your model, and you were defining all the associations explicitly by dictating what the class name was and the foreign key was, and the table name, and all these ancillary details, and then you incrementally started deleting code to show the way that Active Record in Rails works by convention, and then eventually you went from 110 lines or so of code to just the name of the model, and that the model has many tickets and belongs to people, or something like that. And the ultimate point that you made was, we have now distilled this to the core of what the domain was and eliminated all of these ancillary details. In this case, it's a noun, so it isn't really the core of your domain necessarily, but at a small level of granularity, you've removed all of the details that aren't important and just focused on what actually gives value to your business.
Right, yeah, what Eric was talking about yesterday would be an extension to that, where it may be that this was the core domain, but the fact that these techniques allow you to pick whatever it is, you may be wrong, but then just model that directly in code. That's pretty valuable.
Right. So one of the other things that we talked about that could be interesting to talk about here was this fact that there are all these implementations of Ruby. Right? How's that having an impact on the Ruby community? I mean, there's Iron Ruby, JRuby, all these other things. There's
I introduced the Ruby track yesterday by saying that the Ruby community has a fantastic language and a fantastic community and culture, and not necessarily so good runtime, and some weaknesses in the libraries. But all things considered, that's the way I'd like it, rather than the other way around, because the problems that are harder to fix later are the ones that we have got right now. Given all the excitement around Ruby, what a good language it is, what a nice community and culture we have, somebody's going to fix those other problems. And just in the past 2 years, we've seen that sort of start happening on multiple fronts simultaneously, with people attacking how to build a better Ruby runtime. And how many efforts are there going now?
There's at least 4, I think. There's
5.
Rubinius, JRuby, Iron Ruby, the Cardinal stuff, and
Yarv,
which is for the current native original Ruby.
So Yarv is actually,
and I think there are a bunch of, I think there are a few other efforts as well.
X-Ruby.
Yeah. An interesting thing is to think about, for me, is to think about the different motivations for the different implementations of Ruby. So you have a JRuby and an Iron Ruby, where these monolithic companies with tons of infrastructure that they have within their company and tools that they've built, and then people who've used their technologies to create systems that might be 10 years old at this point, and there's a whole integration story and all those things. But then kind of on the other side of the spectrum, you have something like Rubinius, where Evan Phoenix is creating a sandbox for wild ideas, and also and allowing for those wild ideas by having a core that's far more dynamic, far more reflective, gives you control of far more fine-grained pieces of the runtime.
And the portion that's static and written in C is much, much smaller.
Right. So, and interestingly, I think probably a huge motivation for JRuby is performance. Rubinius might end up being very fast, but it has a very different motivation, which is this small talkish design, where you have turtles all the way down. It's all implemented in Ruby except for a really small core. And I think it's really cool that this very well-designed language, in terms of not necessarily the runtime, but the language, has attracted all these different people, and their completely opposing motivations are still satisfied by
Right.
what is just a really wonderful language.
Yes.
It's not of the language.
But how do you maintain compatibility? I thought there is no Ruby language spec, right?
Well,
There
one's
is,
emerging.
Exactly. Yeah, it's emerging in the form of tests and RSpec specifications that are executable, but there is no document that describes Ruby. So fortunately, that's something that the implementers of these various Ruby runtimes have gotten together on, and they're contributing to each other's specifications. Dave, Thomas, and Andy Hunt, many years ago, when they were writing the first version of programming Ruby, created a test suite for the Ruby language. It was called Rubicon. And I got involved with that back in 2001, I think, and helped keep it going a little while. And then when RubyForge came about, we moved the project to RubyForge and opened it up. And the first people to jump on it were Charles Nutter and Tom Anebo, the guys doing JRuby. So now all of these guys are kind of sharing all this test code, and that is becoming the specification for the language. There isn't really an officially sanctioned, this is Ruby, though that's a discussion that is happening at those levels in the Ruby community. So we'll see where that goes.
It's interesting. There have been other languages that sort of didn't have a spec. The spec was the sort of blessed implementation. And a good example of that is Perl, and they realized it was a problem too, and their strategy for dealing with it has been to sort of accept that for Perl 5 and spend a long time designing a spec for Perl 6, and then subsequently, and with some overlap, building an implementation of Perl 6, and that's taken a long time. I don't necessarily know that we'll get a better spec or this is a better approach, but it's just we're doing it a little differently, and we've got multiple implementations of the current language, and they are cooperating on building a spec.
Yeah, and it's also gratifying. It's gratifying that they're all sharing tests and all building test cases out together, and they're creating an executable specification.
Executable spec.
Specification. Another thing that's gratifying is seeing that all these new implementers are respecting Matt's, the original implementer, and not railroading his approach and going off and doing their own thing. And they're mostly striving to understand how the original implementation works and be compatible with it. Having said that, they're starting, now that JRuby has gotten to 1.0 and it's very far along, there are some places where the JRuby team is going, we're just not going to implement that thing. Like they're not implementing continuations, which might go out of Ruby 2 anyway.
And that's a cost issue. It's in that platform. It's going to be very, very hard to do that, and it's rarely used, and so that's a trade-off that makes sense, and they're being upfront about that.
So you don't see anything on the radar or anybody coming out with a, what I would call a real VM, like a real dynamic JIT-like thing?
Yes, I do. That's Rubinius, I think.
That's Rubinius.
Right now,
that way.
Rubinius started as a toy, something for its creator to learn from. Very much the way Ruby started, in fact, and Linux, you know. And what it has done is attracted, because he was doing it as a toy, it's like he didn't have this release date to shoot for. So what he did, when he didn't have a deadline, if he was trying to learn and do something great, Evan Phoenix spent all of his time learning and doing something great, designing things pretty much ideally. And a lot of it is based on the Smalltalk 80, implementation, documentation, all that stuff. So what he has is a really, really solid core, a great flexible design, and the ability to implement most of what is in this thing in Ruby, which means that a lot more people can be included because there are a lot more people in the Ruby community who are good at Ruby than C, right? So now he has a fairly large team with a lot of activity. He's shooting for a 1.0. My prediction is that when Rubinius is complete, it's going to be very, very easy to then make it fast. It's compatible with the C extensions from the real Ruby interpreter now, and I think it's going to actually end up becoming de facto standard at some point.
And this is a necessary first step. The Ruby community is very aware of what it's possible to do with a real dynamic language VM. And Avi Bryant, a former Rubyist and noted small talker, was a keynoter at RailsConf this year, and talked to us about exactly this and how we should learn the lessons of small talk. Last year, Sun open sourced Strongtalk, which was the progenitor of Java Hotspot, today's Sun Java VM, and has all of the dynamic runtime profiling and dynamic optimization and compilation technology that that team, the Strongtalk team, developed and then built into Hotspot. And Avi has also been active in sort of making sure the Ruby community knows about that, and that source base is now there for us to learn from. But before we can really take that step, we have to get to a point where the core library of Ruby is written in Ruby, not C. And that's what Rubinius is going to really contribute.
Yes, right. Yeah, I talked to Gilad Braca
right.
about these same kind of things. Yeah. He was also he was on the Strongtalk.
Yes, he was. Yeah.
And basically the one to manage to have it exposed as open source. Right. So he'd really like to see that his child there turns into something else, because
that work has borne a lot of fruit in the static language community in the form of Hotspot, but those guys were all dynamic language bigots, so I know they're eager for it to bear fruit in the dynamic language world too.
So let's just say thanks for coming. It was nice sitting here with you.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah,
It was great.
And the excellent conference.
Oh yes.
I'm glad you're here.